Good evening. My name is Joaquin Ruiz. I'm the Dean of the College of Science, and I welcome you all to today's lecture from our series, Next. Today we have the pleasure of having with us one of the premier philosophers from the world, actually, and from this country for sure, Dr. Dennett, who will be telling us a little bit about how we have changed our views about things since Darwin. This lecture series, this is the fourth lecture series now that the College of Science has produced. And as I was telling somebody as I was walking down the aisle, this is quite a symbiotic kind of thing, and we will be happy to continue these lecture series as long as you keep showing up. And in fact, I'm incredibly proud to be in a community that brings as many people as we do in our community to listen to science. These lectures are expensive, and there are many people that support the lecture. Cox Communication, Bob Davis, the Galileo Circle, who are members of our community that support the College of Science, Godat Design, Tom and Candy Grogan, Jeff and Shelley Owen, Raytheon, Research Corporation, and Unisource Energy. Today, I am thrilled, in fact, that the individual that's going to be introducing our speaker is Dr. Taylor, who is the president of Research Corporation in town. So it ends up being that this high-tech energy has a humanist running it, and he will be telling us, he will be introducing our speaker tonight. Taylor Lawrence, where are you?
Thanks, Dean Ruiz. I'm actually president of Raytheon. A little bit bigger, but you know. But it's a pleasure to be here. I moved from our corporate headquarters in Massachusetts back in June to take over for Luis Francisconi, who retired on July 1st. And I must say I'm not missing the winter weather back in Massachusetts. But I also have to say that, you know, on a night like tonight when it's below 60, people think it's very wicked weather here too. So I appreciate all of you coming out on such a horrid night here in Arizona to attend. Well, Raytheon is very proud to be a part of this lecture series. We're in our fourth year of providing support to make this free to the public. And one of our struggles at Raytheon, and I recently spoke to the Board of Regents here at the U of A, is promoting math and science and engineering and technology education to our young people and getting them excited about careers in STEM types of fields. And I'm very, very disturbed by some of the things that are going on in our community today, especially with the economy and with some of the actions of our legislature, and strongly support strong funding for the University of Arizona, and I hope we can turn a corner and come back. Because we need a steady pipeline of talent in this state. We need it to preserve the high technology jobs that we have in the state, and I feel very privileged that we have such a fine university and a distinguished College of Science right here in Tucson. And one of the things I've learned about is the U of A's Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department. I didn't realize that in 1975 it was the first of its kind in the world. And now most of the top universities have EEB departments, but ours is ranked in the top 10% of all such programs. And just as impressive, the physical sciences at the U of A were recently ranked #1 by the National Science Foundation among all universities within the United States. And tonight, in celebration of Darwin's 200th birthday, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Daniel C. Dennett. Dr. Dennett is University Professor and Austin B. Fletcher Professor of Philosophy and co-director at the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. He received his BA in philosophy from Harvard in 1963, the year I was born, so I'm kind of a young guy. He then went to Oxford to work with Gilbert Ryle, under whose supervision he completed the DPhil in philosophy in 1965. He taught at UC Irvine from 1965 to 1971 when he moved to Tufts, where he has taught ever since, aside from periods visiting at Harvard, Pittsburgh, Oxford, and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He's the author of a book that's a favorite of mine. In fact, I pulled it out of my library tonight, brought it along, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. I bought this back in 1995. It's been in my library ever since. His most recent book, Breaking the Spell, Religion is a Natural Phenomenon, was published in 2006 by Viking Press. He has received 2 Guggenheim Fellowships, a Fulbright Fellowship, and a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Science, and many, many other awards. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Dennett.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am honored to be here and to see so many of you in this audience. This is a special occasion indeed. But let's get started. As a philosopher, I have to face the fact, and all philosophers do, I think, that some of the greatest thinkers that we philosophers have to consider were not philosophers. Here's 5 of the most important. I haven't labeled them so that you can see who they are. All right, call out the names. Starting from left to right, it is Newton. Next. Yes. Next. Yes, who's the next one? Gödel. That's right, that's Kurt Gödel. And finally there's Turing. Okay, indeed, you're right. So these are all philosophers who weren't philosophers. People, very important thinkers, who are important to philosophical thought. But the number 1 philosopher, in my opinion, who wasn't a philosopher has got to be this one, Charles Darwin. Now, I don't know, when I show this picture, sometimes I get a sort of laugh. I don't know what this is about. I don't know why. I don't myself see any reason for that laugh, but we can get it behind us, and then we can get on to other things. So, why was Darwin's idea so great? I think the answer is really quite straightforward. Darwin's idea of evolution by natural selection united the 2 most disparate parts of our universe, the world of purposeless causation on the one hand, the world of physics and chemistry, with the world of meaning, the world of ethics and poetry. So we go all the way from physics to ethics and poetry, and even beyond that to morality, all in one unified perspective. No other scientific idea or philosophical idea so grandly unifies everything that exists under a single perspective. Now, it's not as if there wasn't an earlier perspective that had the same aspiration. The pre-Darwinian worldview is made famous, among other places, in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's famous paintings, and in the center we see God, the Creator, putting the finishing touches on Adam. I want to call this the trickle-down theory of creation. Adam is pretty wonderful, but he is the creation of something more wonderful still. Adam is pretty smart, but his creator is even smarter, even more intelligent. And I think that this idea may have even been more obvious even to our ancestors, it's maybe an idea that's older than our species. Homo habilis was a hominid that made very simple tools, chipped stone flakes mainly. And I think that maybe Homo habilis had some dim sense that it always takes a big, fancy, smart thing to make a lesser thing. You never see a pot making a potter. You never come across a horseshoe making a blacksmith. It's always big, smart, fancy things making lesser things of one sort or another. That's the trickle-down theory of creation. And it seems indeed quite obvious. Along comes Darwin with what we may call the bubble-up theory of creation. And here I thought, Darwin's birthday, we really should have a little quotation from Darwin himself. And what I've chosen is simply a great long sentence at the end of chapter 4 of Origin of Species, which captures all on one page the main points of the theory. It's often pointed out that this is, as often been said, one long argument. I'm going to bring out the argument by highlighting it. If, during the long course of ages and under varying conditions of life, organic beings vary at all in the several parts of their organization, and I think this cannot be disputed, he puts in a little empirical, he says that's a premise that everybody should accept. If there be, owing to the high geometric powers of increase of each species at some age, season, or year, a severe struggle for life, and this certainly cannot be disputed, then, considering the infinite complexity of the relations of all organic beings to each other and to their conditions of existence, causing an infinite diversity in structure, constitution, and habits to be advantageous to them, I think it would be a most extraordinary fact if no variation ever had occurred useful to each being's own welfare, in the same way that so many variations have occurred useful to man. Now the punchline. But if variations useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly, individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life. And from the strong principle of inheritance, they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. That's it. That is a beautiful, succinct summary of Darwin's great idea. On the face of it, it may not seem so shocking, but to many people, it seemed to be a deeply subversive and even outrageous idea. A critic named Mackenzie summed it up, not right away, but in 1868 in a piece published in the Athenaeum, which was sort of the London Review of Books of its day. And here's Mackenzie's observation about this theory. In the theory with which we have to deal, absolute ignorance is the artificer, so that we may enunciate as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect, a beautiful machine, it is not requisite to know how to make it. The capital letters are in the original. This is a man in high dudgeon. This proposition will be found, on careful examination, to express in condensed form the essential purport of the theory, and to express in a few words all Mr. Darwin's meaning, who, by a strange inversion of reasoning, seems to think absolute ignorance fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. Exactly. That's it. He's got it. That's just exactly the purport of Mr. Darwin's theory. It is a strange inversion of reasoning. It flies in the face of common sense principles that go back to Homo habilis, perhaps. So obvious does it seem to so many people that this cannot be right, that a creationist pamphlet that was sent to me by a student sort of mocks it. Test 2. Do you know of any building that didn't have a builder? Do you know of any painting that didn't have a painter? Do you know of any car that didn't have a maker? If you answered yes for any of the above, give details. This challenge thrown in the face of Darwinians perfectly expresses the sense of just utter incredulity with which many people greet Darwin's great idea. And yet Darwin says, no, I can't show you a building or a painting or a car, but everything in the biosphere has exactly this property that you find so impossible to accept. I mentioned Alan Turing a few minutes ago as another great thinker, and I want to point out a deep commonality between this Brit and that other Brit, Charles Darwin. I want to talk about Turing's strange inversion of reasoning so that you can compare the two. Before Turing, there were computers. Mostly they had degrees in mathematics. Some of them, as you can see, wore dresses. They were people. That was their job. They were called computers. They worked in offices, and they did computation. In the old days, computers had to understand arithmetic, had to appreciate the reasons for what they were doing. Turing recognized that this was not a necessity. In his 1936 paper on computable numbers, he puts it this way: the behavior of the computer at any moment is determined by the symbols which he is observing and his state of mind at the moment, putting state of mind in quotation marks to suggest that this was an eliminable feature. So now let's compare Darwin and Turing. Here's Darwin's strange idea, his strange inversion of reasoning, and I've used Mackenzie's words in their caps. And here's Turing's. In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is. Now, this strikes many people as just about as preposterous as Darwin's inversion, although we do know, thanks to the last 75 years of computer development, that indeed it is true. Indeed, Turing's strange inversion is widely accepted. Put the two together. In order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, it's not requisite to know how to make it. In order to be a perfect and beautiful computing machine, it is not requisite to know what arithmetic is. In fact, they're almost the same point applied in different domains. Now, many people just can't abide Darwin's strange inversion. We call them creationists. Oh, what happened? I left out something here. There. Many people can't abide, but there are other people who are not creationists who also can't abide Darwin's strange inversion. There are many people who can't abide Turing's strange inversion. I propose that we might call them mind creationists. And there are even a few people who seem to be both. In fact, a few very eminent people. Simon Conway Morris, the paleontologist, Jerry Fodor, Thomas Nagel, two very well-known philosophers. Thomas Nagel in a recent piece in Philosophy and Public Affairs. John Searle, who's argued that what he calls original intentionality cannot be achieved by, shall we call it, Turing's strange inversion. Searle treats the mind as what we might call a skyhook. So let me explain my terminology. What is a skyhook? In Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I draw a distinction between skyhooks and cranes. The way to understand this is to recognize that design, the work of design, can be considered to be lifting in design space. Imagine the space of all possible designs of every sort, artificial and natural, and think of the work of R&D, research and development, as lifting. It takes energy, it takes time in design space. Now, intelligent design, or the work of intelligence, can be considered then lifting in design space. Then skyhooks are miraculous top-down lifters. They are things that just float high in that space somehow without being the products of a laborious process of non-miraculous R&D. Cranes, in contrast, do good lifting, but they've been put in position by non-miraculous bubble-up processes. So now we have this metaphor for understanding the relationship between Darwin's idea and his critics. Darwin's bubble-up theory says, over billions of years, non-miraculous, non-intelligent forces have gradually created more and more design, and among those designs are cranes which speed up the lifting, make the lifting more efficient, and by these processes cascaded together, we can get anywhere in design space where anything exists. How do you rebut that? You look for something that couldn't be arrived at by that bubble-up process, something that had to come into existence just hanging there in design space thanks to some special act of intelligent creation. It can seem that some design is too wonderful to have evolved. It's irreducibly complex, requiring a top-down helping hand. So what critics and skeptics of evolution have been looking for 150 years are skyhooks. They want to have examples of living things, phenomena in the biosphere, that are so marvelous, so supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, that there's just no path from the Darwinian starting point up to them. They are irreducibly complex. Over the years, hunting for skyhooks has actually led to some very good science, because people have looked for skyhooks and they've discovered cranes. They think it's impossible that the following thing could ever evolve. They set out to prove that it's impossible, and they end up discovering some new lifting device that makes it possible after all. I'm going to discuss a few in a few minutes. Now, of course, when I talk about skyhooks, this is not what I have in mind. Somebody sent me this photograph recently. Apparently, there's a lighter-than-air company somewhere, I think in Europe, that makes what they call skyhooks. These are really cranes because they're non-miraculous. This is a skyhook. This wonderful satiric drawing appeared in the Atlantic Monthly a few years ago. And it's particularly appropriate because those of you who are into art history will recognize that this is Brunelleschi's dome in Florence. And at the time it was built, it was an engineering marvel. It was considered one of the great, almost nearly miraculous structures in the world. And placing that lantern on the top was the crowning achievement. This is not, of course, how Brunelleschi achieved that. In fact, how he achieved it was by inventing a whole new series of cranes that had never been seen before. And those cranes, they're like these. These are not actually Brunelleschi's drawings. These cranes made possible the exploration of parts of architectural design space that heretofore had not been accessible. That's how cranes operate. Well, now, many people, when they think about evolution, think about what they think. They accept that evolution can explain some things and not others. For instance, they're inclined to say, yeah, I think evolution can explain, say, a nightingale, but not an ode to a nightingale. Really? You think an ode to a nightingale is that much more wonderful than a nightingale? Think of the intricacy, the wonderfulness of a nightingale. If that can be produced by ultimately mechanical, non-miraculous processes, you don't think a poem could be produced by somewhat different but also non-miraculous processes? This is a good example of the resistance that is felt in many quarters to evolution, to the Darwinian perspective. People say, well, yes, I see how the bubble-up theory of creation can explain a lot of things. Birds, beaver dams, but not poems, and not, you know, the Hoover Dam. I think this is very short-sighted. Now, I want to sketch the bubble-up path. It'll have to be a sketch because there isn't that much time. Because along the way, I think we get some insights. What we see here is a cover of Science magazine of a few years ago, and what it shows is a motor protein trudging along inside a cell. Now, I used this diagram for some time, and just recently I discovered a superb animation of a motor protein, much more realistic than this, which I want to share with you. There it is. We're made of trillions of these little fellows. Really, we are. You have trillions of these in your body. Not millions, billions, trillions of them. You couldn't live without them. And they are not even alive, they're proteins. They are motor proteins. So we're made of trillions of mindless little robots. Not a one of them knows who we are or cares. In fact, not a one of them knows a darn thing. They are, as Mackenzie would say, absolutely ignorant. But stop, we know, we care. How can this be? How come? How can things that care and understand and know be constructed out of mindless little robots by the trillions? That's the task for the Darwinian bubble-up path to explain. Along the way, there were some very important cranes, and the one I want to concentrate on is the eukaryotic revolution, which takes us back roughly 2.5 billion years. Life began on this planet about 1 billion years earlier than that. So for 1 billion years, all there were on this planet were simple cells, so-called prokaryotes like bacteria. And then one day, a wonderful thing happened. Prokaryote A, prokaryote B bumped into each other. And instead of B eating A, or A eating B from the inside, B left A intact, and A and B joined forces to become a single thing, an AB. And in this refraining from eating, you might say, well, it's a good meal, but instead of having a good meal, picked up 1 billion years of independent R&D, incorporated into the structure of that thing, giving it an instant multiplication of competence. It joined forces with the cell, taking advantage of all that design. Lynn Margulis is the scientist at UMass who is responsible, I think, for weathering lots of storms and getting people to take this idea seriously when they didn't. It is now textbook fare and many, many demonstrations and proofs of this, the symbiotic origins of the eukaryotic cell. And the eukaryotic cells are bigger and more complex They have more moving parts. Here is, on the left, you see a sort of simple sketch of a prokaryote. On the right, a eukaryote. And you see the little yellow ovals. Those are mitochondria. They have their own DNA, just the way the prokaryote does. In fact, you have your mitochondrial DNA and you have your nuclear DNA in the nucleus. So there's sort of two genomes right there. And every cell in your body, every human cell in your body is a eukaryotic cell, and it has its nuclear DNA, that's your genome, and it has its mitochondrial DNA. And that DNA is descended from that original endosymbiotic revolution. Eukaryotes are more complex. They're more talented. They're more versatile. This versatility permitted a division of labor. And that permitted multicellular life. Because you could have bone cells and blood cells and liver cells and brain cells and all the other kinds of cells, all eukaryotic cells. By being versatile and by specializing, they could create this division of labor, which makes multicellular life like you and me, and like every plant and every animal on land or in sea. They're all eukaryotes. Here's one, not a very fancy one. It's a caddisfly larva. Here's something that it builds. It's a food sieve. It lives in the water. It builds this amazing structure in the flowing water. The water flows in, as you can see, in the funnel. The food gets trapped on the sieve. The water escapes, and then the larva can just scrape up the food off the sieve. This is quite an ingenious artifact, I think you'd have to believe, and it's made by such a simple organism, a caddis larva. It bears a certain striking resemblance to this food sieve. Some similar features, some similar purposes. What's the difference between them? The difference between them is that although there are reasons for the arrangement of the parts in the caddis larva's food sieve, and there are also in the lobster trap, they're not represented anywhere. They're not represented in the caddis larva's nervous system. They're not represented in natural selection. They're not represented at all. Whereas in the case of the lobster trap, the reasons for the parts are represented in the minds of the people that make lobster traps, or the people who order lobster traps, or the people who design lobster traps. These reasons that we see in the case of the caddis larva are what I call free-floating rationales of evolution. They are the reasons why structures in the biosphere have the shapes and parts that they do, but they're not reasons that were represented anywhere until some clever biologist figured them out and represented them. But that had nothing to do with their coming into existence. One of my favorite examples is the cuckoo chick. Now, cuckoos are brood parasites. Cuckoos do not make their own nests. The cuckoo mother, when she's ready to lay her egg, finds the nest of another species that's just been built, the eggs have been laid, and she waits in hiding, watching until the parents that have built that nest and laid those eggs fly away to feed. Then she swoops down, lays her egg in the nest, rolls one of the host eggs out. That's just in case the host can count. That's the reason. And goes away, flies away, never to return. The hosts come back. Things look all right. They incubate the eggs. And the cuckoo egg incubates faster than the others. So the cuckoo chick is the first one out, and the first thing it does is to try to roll the other eggs out of the nest. This is an artist's sketch, but I want to show you a little film clip.
The cuckoo's egg looks like the warbler's, and the number of eggs hasn't changed. Everything appears normal, but appearances can be deceiving. Something is not quite right. One chick has hatched way before the others, and it is ejecting the remaining eggs.
I think you have to agree there's plenty of sign of purpose there. The reason for this behavior is all too clear. But relax. The cuckoo chick doesn't understand the reason. It doesn't have to understand the reason. It knows not what it does. Natural selection tracks that reason, and it creates things that have purposes, such as that purpose. But the organisms themselves don't need to know their purposes. The need-to-know principle reigns in the biosphere just as it does at the CIA, but it has a different rationale. In the CIA, the reason why the need-to-know principle is invoked, only give your agents the information they absolutely need to know, is because then if they're captured and tortured and spill the beans, they don't have many beans to spill. That's one reason for the need-to-know principle. Evolution's reason is rather simpler: thrift. If an organism doesn't need to know the reason why it's doing something, don't provide it. The organism will do just fine. It will be the beneficiary of that purpose without comprehending it at all. Now, there's a common error when people study, and not just lay people, even scientists, when they study animals that exhibit such purposes. What happens is we attribute more understanding to the agent than need be. And the reason for this, I submit, is because we lack a familiar concept of what we might call semi-understood quasi-representations. There's no term for that. Or hemi-semi-demi-understood pseudo-representations. There's just no everyday words for these things. This is where Turing comes in. It is Turing's strange inversion that gives us the vocabulary and the concepts to think about such strange and unnatural states of affairs. Computer programs that don't really understand, but they sort of understand, and those aren't really representations, they're only sort of representations, but they get the job done. Now, sometimes birds can do things that are much more dramatic and interesting, and I'm going to show you an example. So this is a New Caledonian crow. No sound on this. It's been given just a piece of wire, and it's trying to get some food out of this beaker. No success. Here's the tree of life. It doesn't look much like a tree of life because we're looking at it from the bird's eye view, actually, from on top. In the root, you can see at the center there, where that Y is, that's the last universal common ancestor of everything alive on the planet today. And you see the bacteria on the left and the archaea up on the upper right. And down on the bottom here, we see the eukarya, the eukaryotic cells. And it's been drawn so that out at the end of the eukaryotic branch, there's three closely related genera: Coprinus, Homo, and Zea. Homo, of course, is us. The other two are, close relatives, relatively speaking, of us. That's mushrooms, us, and corn. Yes, you are closely related to corn, you are closely related to mushrooms. You have more genes in common with each of them than you do with the other branches on the tree of life. All of that tree of life, oh, here's another, better, more recent picture of the eukaryotes. I won't bother explaining that. Time is short. All of that has to happen about 3.5 billion years. We split off from, from our common ancestor with the chimpanzee roughly 6 million years ago. And it is just as wrong to say that we evolved from chimpanzees as to say that chimpanzees evolved from us. We both evolved from a common ancestor. Chimpanzees have been evolving away from that common ancestor just as long as we have. But probably that ancestor was a lot more, in most regards, like a chimpanzee than it is like us. But in any case, the differences between us and the chimpanzee all have to have been accumulated by R&D that occurs in the last 6 million years. But now I want to leap ahead, ignoring all the interesting complexities about hominid evolution, and go to the recent past when Homo sapiens, when our species was already well established, around the time of the dawn of agriculture. Paul MacCready, the visionary engineer, the creator of the Gossamer Albatross, calculated a few years ago that at that time, shortly after the dawn of agriculture, human beings, plus all their livestock and all their pets, was just a fraction of 1% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass. That is to say, that doesn't include the insects or the worms, it doesn't include the fish in the sea. This is the terrestrial vertebrate biomass, roughly what everyday folks call animals. So, us plus all our animals was less than a fraction of 1% just 10,000 years ago. What do you suppose it is today? Quite a bit more. What do you think, 20%, 30%? 50%? How could it be 50%? MacCready calculates that it's 98%. Now, most of that's cattle. We, plus our domesticated animals, have swamped the world in just 10,000 years. Here's what MacCready has to say about it. Over billions of years on a unique sphere, chance has painted a thin covering of life, complex, improbable, wonderful, and fragile. Suddenly, we humans, forget the parenthesis, it's false, have grown in population, technology, and intelligence to a position of terrible power. We now wield the paintbrush. All of this in 10,000 years. As he says, it's the technology and intelligence that permit us to do this. Compare the Cambrian explosion, which was another great event in the history of life. It occurred over millions of years, and it occurred about 530 million years ago. That's when so many new body plans evolved over a relatively very short period of time and created so much of the diversity of life forms. This has been famous by Steve Gould in his book, Wonderful Life. And that was indeed one of the great explosive creative periods of evolution. But compare that with the MacCready explosion, which occurred over 10,000 years. That's only about 500 human generations. It's a remarkably swift biological change to the planet, and we're right at the center of it. It's not just genes. There's a second information highway from parents to offspring that we, and really we alone, have optimized. Richardson and Boyd, in their wonderful book, Not by Genes Alone, examine the conditions under which this could happen. And they point out that culture is transmitted more generally than genes. You get your genes from your parents, that is vertical transmission. But once this second highway from parents to offspring is established, you can then get what they call oblique transmission, or even horizontal transmission, where you get a lot of this information not from your parents, but from your peers, from other people, people not related to you at all. Once this information highway is established between parent and offspring, it can be co-opted and exploited by all of these other elements, which they call rogue cultural variants. To get the idea, you might want to think about the internet and spam. The internet wasn't created to make spam possible. It wasn't created to make pornography possible. But once it exists and is in good shape, all kinds of rogue cultural variants begin to take advantage of it, as we all know. Those rogue cultural variants are what Richard Dawkins calls memes. Cultural items that replicate and spread through human populations thanks to their culture. Memes, says Dawkins, are analogous to genes. They're information structures. They bear information. He also points out that they're analogous to viruses. Now, what is a virus, actually? It is really a sort of naked gene. It's just sort of all gene and no body. Or, as I like to say, a virus is a string of nucleic acid with attitude. It doesn't have a mind. It is absolutely ignorant. But it does have the amazing competence, the competence of being able to insert itself, because of its shape, into a cell that does have copy machinery there, and to commandeer that copy machinery and get it to make copies of itself rather than of the cell's own DNA. That's how viruses replicate, and of course, natural selection operates over them very effectively. To take a well-known example, HIV, a virus, a non-living replicator, has evolved more just in terms of codon change since it was first sequenced not so many years ago than we have evolved from our common ancestor with the chimpanzee 6 million years ago. It's very fast. A meme is a data structure made of information with attitude. It's the same sort of thing as a virus. But it doesn't insert itself into an individual cell and get the cell's copy machinery to work. It inserts itself into an individual head, into a brain, and gets the brain to make the copies, and then to spit them out, to transmit them, to broadcast them, the way I'm doing right now. I am spraying you with memes, some of which are no doubt going to enter not only your ears, but your minds. And there they will proliferate and replicate, and then you'll spread them to somebody else, and it will be viral. You get the idea. Let's put in a little skeptical interlude. What evidence is there that memes even exist? Well, if you believe that words exist, then you believe that memes exist, because words are memes that can be pronounced. There are other memes that can't be, but words, how many of you believe in words? All right, they're memes that can be pronounced. If you doubt the existence of words, then you can doubt the existence of memes. In other words, we're apes with infected brains. Or you might say we are euprimates, like those eukaryotic cells. Our brains are invaded by virtual machines designed by natural selection, and these virtual machines give us powers which give us the versatility to take organization up a level. Remember that original endosymbiotic origin of eukaryotes, where B got 1 billion years of R&D for free by just joining forces, by just taking that other prokaryote in and not eating it, not taking it apart, because that would have lost all the information, or most of the information. Similarly, when you take in memes, you don't eat them. You don't take them apart. You leave their structure intact, because that's the products of many years of design. None of you had to invent the wheel, or long division, or statistics, or finding averages, or reading maps. All of these wonderful tools are culture-born, and you just help yourself to them and you pack them into your head. Our power depends on the culture that permits us to divide labor and share expertise, so that we can create organizations like universities, like churches, like armies, like clubs, like institutions, which depend on a division of labor and depend on our complexity. From this perspective, we're able to see that among the fruits on the tree of life are both spider webs and power grids, both beaver dams and the Hoover Dam, both the bird's nest and the ode to a nightingale. These are all artifacts made by organisms, and in the case of the human organisms, these are artifacts that are made possible by the establishment in those brains of evolved virtual machines, memes, that give them their powers. So now I want to approach the delicate transition from bottom-up Darwinian R&D to top-down creative genius R&D, because after all, we do have this clear image that sometimes people are really geniuses and are really creative. They are intelligent designers. Well, as Bo Dalbum once said, you can't do much carpentry with your bare hands, and you can't do much thinking with your bare brain. If you're going to do some really creative thinking, you need lots of thinking tools. Fortunately, there's a lot of them lying around. Those are those memes that I was telling you about. And so you take them in, and you make them your own, and you learn to use them, and that equips your mind with all sorts of prosthetic devices that you can then use to create things. So what I'm suggesting is that words are sort of tools. They're not always elements in grammatical constructions. For instance, passwords and labels are individual words that have very nice uses quite independently of any grammar, of any syntax. Interestingly enough, both passwords and labels are echoes of designs that evolution has found much earlier in the animal world as well. We've sort of rediscovered tricks that evolution discovered long ago. My dear friend and sometimes co-author Doug Hofstadter, in his 2006 book, I Am a Strange Loop, gives us a list, a toolkit, and it includes a wonderful list of tools in his kit. And they're in your kit too. Here they are: wild goose chases, tackiness, dirty tricks, sour grapes, elbow grease, feet of clay, loose cannons, crackpots, lip service, slam dunks, feedback. Each of these is a thinking tool. If you've got it, if it's part of your kit, you can think more effectively, more efficiently, more swiftly. You can categorize things, you can find similarities, you can reason about similarities better with these tools than you could otherwise. These are tools that are made of not steel and wood and so forth. They're made of technique, they're made of information, they're recipes for action. And some of them are obviously that, like long division is a nice tool, statistics is a nice tool. They're rather like Java applets, if you're into thinking about these in computer terms. They're informational structures that enhance the powers of the Turing machine that you have between your ears. What are Java applets made of? They're made of information. Well, they're made of bits, but they have no material basis other than that, and much is the same of words. What's long division made of? It's made of, it's an algorithm. It's made of just information. It's a recipe for doing something. What's cost-benefit analysis made of? These are excellent tools that are not made of any material. They're made of information. They are, as we say, virtual machines. And this is the technology that has remade the brain and basically that makes the human minds. Now, who designs all these treasures that we share? Well, there are heroes of design that can be assigned authorship for some of those treasures. People like Pythagoras and Plato and Descartes and Newton and Shakespeare and Austen and Curie and many others. But in general, no. Most of the treasures that you have stored up in your head have no authors at all. Nobody designed language. Nobody designed tonal music. But then what are you? What am I? Who uses these tools? Is there a Cartesian ego in there that equips itself with the tools? No. That is not what is in there. What is in there is just an alliance of hemi, semi, demi, understood quasi-representations, just a whole bunch of memes in there, forming a superstructure which then has the interesting role of being a virtual machine made of smaller, simpler virtual machines. And it guards the entrance and evaluates yet other virtual machines. This still looks ominous to most people, but I want to try to take away the bad aroma of this idea by pointing to something that Darwin did in The Origin of Species. He began that book by looking at methodical selection, that is, where plant and animal breeders set out with foresight and deliberately and with intention, with consciousness, to try to improve the breed, to make a faster racehorse, a smarter dog, a more beautiful pigeon, and so forth. And then he pointed out that that works, but also so does what he calls unconscious selection. This is where people, without intending a thing, without meaning a thing, without knowing what they're doing, inadvertently, their actions tend to bias the survival of their domesticated plants and animals, and this leads to accumulated change in those domesticated species. This is still going on today. And then he uses that as a segue into natural selection. So we start with an attempt at intelligent design, and then we get design which isn't really intelligent, it's just unconscious, and then we get natural selection where there's no mind involved at all, just the vicissitudes of nature. Now, more recently, of course, we've added one at the top. We've added genetic engineering, which is like methodical selection, only more efficient in that we don't wait for nature to generate the genomes that we then put to the test. Now, we can do the same thing with memes. Working backwards, let's start at the bottom, or working in the other direction from the previous slide. First, we have what we might call the natural selection of synanthropic memes. Synanthropic memes are the rats and bedbugs and squirrels and pigeons of the meme world. They're not domesticated, we don't own them, we don't love them, they're well designed by natural selection to live in our company and to exploit us in various ways. But pretty soon we get unconscious selection, where we have, for instance, tunes that replicate, and only the most memorable, the most unforgettable, the most lilting tunes survive and make copies, and the rest go extinct. And you get what the Germans call earworms. Those terrible tunes that you can't get out of your head. You don't like it. You don't want to own it. You're just stuck with it. And now you're going to pass it to your neighbor, who's going to hate you for it. But there are memes that we love, that we honor, that we respect, and that we go way out of our way to make sure that they replicate in our children, in our friends, in our young. And like other domesticated species, like laying hens, for instance, which would probably go extinct if they were left on their own in nature, because their capacity to reproduce and to incubate their eggs has been pretty well bred out of them. so that people have to work hard to get hens to reproduce. And similarly, I'll give you an example, calculus. Or maybe here at UA, people find this just the most wonderful, infectious idea. You just can't get it out of your head. So catchy, calculus. So infectious. Just can't get those derivatives out of my head. I doubt it. No, these memes have to be very deliberately and laboriously replicated in generation after generation. And then, of course, we have mimetic engineering, which is what people in advertising do, and spin doctors and other people who try to do intelligent design of cultural items that will then fly, that will become viral, that will pass from person to person. What this all permits us to do is a certain sort of bootstrapping. It's worked in the past and it'll work again. I'm going to give you one example of bootstrapping, which should stand for thousands, actually. How do you draw a straight line? Think about it. It's easy. Get a piece of paper and a pencil and a straight edge. You put the straight edge down on the paper, you draw the line. That's how you do it. It's easy. Use a straight edge. Where'd you get the straight edge? Oh, you got the straight edge from a straight edge manufacturer. How did he make the straight edge? Well, you see, he had this straight edge, and he put a piece of metal down, and where did he get his straight edge? Well, from a super straight edge manufacturer, and so forth. But that's not an infinite regress, it's a finite regress. And it turns out to be a fairly interesting one. This is from a 1970 book, and it shows a circa 1960 high-quality straight edge, about as good as you could make at that time. The history of the evolution of straight edges is really quite an interesting phenomenon. They got better and better, and one of the key elements in their getting better is that they began to use their other memes to represent the goal of making better and better straight edges. Here is a wonderful diagram from that book. That wiggly line that you see there is a representation of a straight edge, as good a straight edge as they could make in 1960. It's a gauge block, and it shows the imperfections in that surface magnified 1,000,000-fold. Once you've got the capacity to represent your reasons for making things, unlike the caddisfly larva, once you can represent the reasons and then represent the falling short of the perfections that you can define, you're on an accelerated path to competence. The ideal of a perfectly straight line, or as Plato might say, the form of the straight, was arrived at by approximation, both of the artifacts and of the idea itself. The form of the good has a similar history, and for that matter, the form of the true. What makes us human, then, is not so much our genetic children as our brain children. We alone represent our reasons. We can think about our values, our reasons, and that is the source of our creativity. We, the reason representers, now can look back and discover the reasons everywhere in the tree of life, the unrepresented reasons for all of the parts in the tree of life before here, before us. It took Darwin to discover that a mindless process created all those reasons. We, intelligent designers, then are among the effects, the very recent effects, not the cause of all those purposes. Some of you may notice I have a little Darwin fish, an evolving fish. I had this pin on several years ago at a conference, and the physicist Murray Gell-Mann was there, and he's a very learned gentleman, and he said, "Dan, I like your pin." He said, "Do you know that the Christian fish symbol was the first acronym? Ichthys," that's what you see there in the middle, "Ichthys is the Greek word for fish. And it stood for Jesus Christos Theou Ios Soter, Jesus Christ, God, Son, and Savior. That's why they use the fish. I said, that's very nice, Murray. I'm really interested. He said, what I want to know, Dan, is what does DARWIN stand for? I thought, that's a very good question. Well, I'm not really a classical scholar, but I did take Latin in high school for a while, and I thought, let me work on that, see what I can come up with. So I went off and had a cup of coffee and got out my pencil and worked at it for a while, and I came up with something which seems to fit pretty well. So here we go. Here's DARWIN. There's no W in Latin, so you have to use W. Okay? Delere auctorem rerum, ut universum infinitum noscas. Destroy or delete the author of things in order to understand the infinite universe. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Dennett will be happy to answer your questions.
If we can see anybody.
If we can see anyone, yes.
Maybe we should have the lights up. There we go.
Right here.
I know you've had a number of constructive debates with Dreyfus, Hubert Dreyfus. Do you consider him a skyhook proponent or something else? I'm sort of curious where he would stand in there. Thank you.
Yeah, Hubert Dreyfus at Berkeley, a phenomenologist, good philosopher, longtime critic of artificial intelligence. Yes, I would call him a mind creationist because he has supposed that it was in principle impossible to build up from the Turing base to a mind with creativity and intelligence. He thinks that the sort of insight that human minds have is beyond the scope of not just current AI, but any imaginable AI. That makes him a mind creationist. He thinks of mind as a skyhook.
We thought until about 18 months ago that we had evolved some very impressive economic structures which went crashing and burning since then. Is that an evolution that went wrong? Or?
Evolution doesn't guarantee success. After all, think of it this way. Something like 99% of the species that have ever existed are now extinct. Something like but here's a more hopeful way of thinking of it. 99% or more, much more than 99%, of all the things that have ever lived have died childless. But not a single one of your ancestors did. Think of how lucky that makes you. You sit at the end of an incredibly lucky strain that goes back 3.5 billion years without a single ancestor that died childless.
Dr. Dennett, you talked about things, cultures such as tonal music and religion, poetry, even earworms, things which have universal appeal among all cultures, but apparently no reasonable basis for them at all that I can tell. I mean, there is a theory which attempts to explain the universality, the compellingness of such things by describing them as an artifact of the evolution of consciousness, a theory which says that consciousness itself is a product of memes rather than vice versa. And I'm talking about the theory of the bicameral mind by Dr. Julian Jaynes. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah. First of all, I got a lot of good ideas from Julian, and I hope I've given him credit along the way. I'm a fan of that book too, but I think Julian Jaynes' book is a classic book. It's also a sort of cult classic because it has some wonderful ideas, and it has some ideas that I think are just daft. And I don't think Jaynes could tell the difference between them. But that's like a lot of other creative geniuses. So I have been happy to mine his work for good insights over the years. And in my own theory of consciousness, which you also sort of described right there, I've drawn heavily on some of those. But let me quickly say something about your point about, you know, whether there's any basis for the survival of memes. To me, the single most important gift of the mimetic perspective when we look at culture is that it acknowledges and it helps us to see that cultural items can persist not because they're good for us, not because they're true, not because they're wonderful, but just because they can replicate in our brains. Now, many replicate in our brains because they're wonderful. And those are the ones that we particularly seek out and domesticate and try to foster. Of course, we're not always very good judges of that. But it's very important to remember that some cultural items have their own fitness, independently of our fitness. When I was working on my book on religion, and people were learning that I was looking at the evolution of religion and of religious memes, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, Dan, that's really interesting. What do you think religions are for? After all, every human group that's ever been looked at closely has religion of some form or other. This has got to be good for something, right?" And I said, "No, not necessarily. It might be, but not necessarily. Every human group that's ever been studied has the common cold. What's that good for? It's good for itself. It replicates because it can. It has its own fitness. And so do memes. Now, many memes have their fitness, as it were, in spite of our efforts to eradicate them, or in spite of the fact that we don't particularly care for them. Others have their fitness because we treasure them dearly, rightly or wrongly. If you want to have a good theory of cultural evolution, which I very much want, you should start with a level playing field, which says we need to explain the fitness of memes in their own terms first, and then we can see which of them are, if you like, mutualists, which one of them are beneficial to us, and which of them are parasites and are not beneficial to us. Both are possible.
This masterful lecture this evening was the end, at this point, it's going on of course, but of 50 years of fighting the creationists. And I think we all should get down on our knees and thank God for the creationists, because they forced us to get our stuff together. Thank you, sir.
Yes, Professor. I was thinking about three constants, time, sleep, and memory, and how they are combined. Also, I'd like to make an inquiry into time machines. Is memory a time machine, a simplistic form of a time machine? And in speaking of space-time, that time, does time have memory?
Well, I'm just going to take part of that, the part that I'm sure I understand. And what I like to say is that brains, the job of brains is to produce future, to produce expectations. And they do this by mining the past and the present and then turning that ore into expectations about the future. That's what brains are, anticipation makers. That's why we got them. And our brains, we can look farther and better into the future than any other species. We can conceive of events that will happen long after we are dead. We can conceive of events that happen all over the universe. We're the only species that can do this. So, but every species has a brain, the job of which it is to extract information from the world and use it to better anticipate what's going to happen next. So there is a deep relationship between memory and expectation and mind.
I think it's fascinating to hear about all these processes that go on in our brain, and I can almost visualize these neurons firing like crazy to each other. But why do we actually have to have the sensation of thinking? And what is it actually, and what is it really good for? I think one of the philosophers, one of your colleagues, once stated, why aren't we all zombies?
Well, there's no short answer to your question, except this. We are all zombies. That is to say, we, and we alone, are creatures who are equipped, when asked, to talk about what we've been thinking about. A penny for your thoughts, somebody says, and we can answer. We are the kind of being that, because we have language, is able to access some small subset of the processes that are going on in our brains, those neural processes you speak of. But when we do access them, our capacities to verbalize have to be run through a sort of metaphorical sieve first, so that we can only speak in sort of unconscious metaphor about the processes actually going on in our brain. But we can do that. And that, sir, is what consciousness is.
Is that why we all clapped when the arms missile maker appeared on stage to introduce you?
I don't know.
I think we will call it quits here and thank Dr. Dennett for a wonderful talk. If you should happen to come here at this time next week, you will be surprised that there isn't another talk. Instead, there is a Beethoven concert with the Eroica Symphony and the Emperor Piano Concerto. But Dr. Elena Plant will be talking the following week, so please write it on your calendars. She will be talking about observing the brain at work, seeing those neurons firing, and starting on the process of trying to understand how we actually go about thinking. So I'd not only like to thank Dr. Dennett again, but also Dr. Taylor for coming here to introduce him. Thank you.